Hey, it's Justin with Shock Therapy, and today we're going to show you how to install a billet race rack in a Polaris XP or XP Turbo. This billet race rack gives you a ton of strength compared to the stock unit. Typically, the stock rack and pinion wears out over time, and if you run larger wheels and tires or different wheel offsets, you can break the factory rack gear right in half. Our billet race rack will stop all of those possibilities completely. It's also rebuildable, so if you race the car, you can go ahead and freshen it up from season to season. Something that is very important that we put into the design of this rack is that the end of the rack gears use rod ends. Do not remove those rod ends from the rack. The clevis that we supply threads directly into the tie rod that you're using. The reason that this is important is because the pivoting point of those rod ends and tie rods changes width if you were to swap the clevis and the rod end around. When you widen the system, it creates bump steer and a ton more load on the system. Never remove the rod ends from the rack. Keep them inside there and run the clevis on the tie rod. Our billet race racks come with a pre-grease for assembly. They are not completely full. When you install the rack, make sure that you cycle the system back and forth while greasing it at least 10 pumps. We will show you exactly how to do that. So let's not waste any more time and pitch this off to Ernie so he can show us how to install it in a car.
Step 1. Jack the front of the car up until the tires are off the ground. Next, remove the wheels and tires from the front end. Make sure that you're safe and use jack stands at all times while installing the rack. Next, remove the outer tie rod joints from the spindle. Break the jam nuts loose with hand tools and unthread the tie rods from the factory inner rack joints. Loosen the pinch bolt that holds the factory U-joint from the steering shaft, connecting to the upper gear of the rack and pinion. You might find it easy to rotate the steering so that you have access to this pinch bolt. But once you've removed the pinch bolt, make sure that the steering is replaced in the center position.
Make sure that the steering of the car is centered while you remove the stock rack. You can now remove all of the frame hardware and remove the stock rack from the car. There is no prep needed for the new billet rack to go into the car, other than making sure that it's centered when you install it. Another trick when installing the rack is to loosen the 4 bolts that hold the front differential to the frame. Leave the bolts installed, but loose. Lift the front of the differential up with a pry bar. This will lower the drive line, giving you extra room to slide the billet race rack into position. With the race rack in its rough position and the hardware in the rack, you can line it up with the frame mounts. While lining it up with the frame mounts, you can slide the pinion gear into the steering shaft. Make sure that the rack is still centered and the steering and steering wheel are also centered as you install this. With the steering column slid over the pinion gear, you can now tighten all of the frame hardware holding the rack to the chassis. Don't forget to tighten the front differential bolts that you loosened to make it easier to install the rack.
With the rack installed in the car, you can prepare the tie rods to be installed. First, slide the new rack boots over the tie rod with the large end facing the rack. Next, thread the clevis that comes with the rack and pinion into the tie rod. Never remove the rod ends from the rack and replace them with the clevis. The rod ends must stay in the rack and the clevis must thread into the tie rod. Install the clevis on the rod end on the rack and pinion with the shoulder bolt supplied. Now install the tie rod outer joint back onto the spindle. Next, tighten the supplied shoulder bolt at the clevis to inner rod end mounting position. Jack the car up off the jack stands and install the wheels and tires once again. Put the car back on the ground and settle the front suspension. You can jump up and down on the front bumper. You can fire the car up and move it back and forth. We would highly recommend that you move the car back and forth at least 10 feet a couple of times to settle the front end. Next, you can do a rough measurement for the toe set by measuring the front of the tires and the back of the tires as compared to each other. You want to have the tires toed in 1/4 of an inch. It's always a good idea to stand in front of the car and compare the front tire to the rear. You want to make sure that the front tires are facing the same direction, if not perfectly parallel, with the rear tires. This ensures that the tires are facing forward and the rack is centered. From this point forward, adjust all toe sets equally left and right, bringing the front of the tires in 1/4 of an inch for a total of 1/4 inch toe.
15 3/4.
Once you've set the car with 1/4 inch toe in, you can lock all of the jam nuts on the tie rods in that position. With all the hardware tight and the rack boots off of the rack, it's time to grease the rack and pinion. It's best done with someone turning the wheel back and forth as you grease the rack. You can expect to grease the rack at least 5 to 10 grease pumps or until grease comes out of the rack gear portion of the rack body. Make sure you're cycling it back and forth as you do this. Only stop once you see grease come out the ends. With the rack greased properly, you can install the rack boots by pulling them over the clevis bolt to the point where the clevis bolt is in the center of the boot. You want the large end of the boot on the rack body, in the boot groove, retained with a zip tie. The small end of the boot on the tie rod, zip tied as well. The idea is the boot covers the end of the rack body and covers the clevis and rod end joint completely. Keep in mind that rack boots are a wearing item and should be checked from time to time. They will gain holes or tears, and as soon as they do, contact us for spares. With the zip ties tightly in place, using a set of side cutters, trim the excess ends off. Your install is now complete.
Hopefully your installation of the Billet race rack went as easy as it did for us. As we have always said throughout our instructions, make sure that you take your car to a qualified alignment shop to make sure the alignment is perfect. Our rough settings will get you started, but always take it to a qualified shop. One thing to keep in mind is that these racks are rebuildable and serviceable, but you should always keep up on the grease inside the rack from trip to trip. If you're racing your car, make sure that you grease the rack between each race. Even if your car is just a play car, it's a good idea to re-grease the rack every 400 to 600 miles. Another thing to keep in mind is that this race rack is not a waterproof system. It is water resistant. So if you run the thing underwater in the mud, always make sure that you're checking the system, make sure it's not overly dry, and keep up on the grease. Also, once you start to get a little bit of play in the rack, due to the time or wearing it out with mud inside the rack, you can always send it in. We'll take care of all the rebuild and components and send it back. The best way to keep your rack healthy is to make sure that the boots have no holes in them from race to race or trip to trip. As soon as the boots have some holes or tears, make sure you replace them right away and keep all the debris out of the rack. Although our race rack is pretty much bulletproof, the lifespan of the rack will vary from car to car. If you have portal axles, bad steering geometry, and 40-inch tires, you're going to wear the rack out a lot quicker than someone who has 32s and perfect geometry. Keep this in mind as you're inspecting the rack from trip to trip. If you ever find a little bit too much play, send it in, we'll rebuild it. The lifespan of the rack will be increased if you keep up on the grease and also make sure that the boots are sealed. If you have any more questions on the installation of this rack or would like to check out more products that we offer at Shock Therapy, go to shocktherapist.com or call us at 623-217-4959.